The year is 1804. Paris, once the city of revolution and liberty, is draped in banners celebrating Napoleon Bonaparte's coronation. Trumpets blare, church bells thunder, and the people cheer as the former general places the crown upon his own head, declaring himself Emperor of the French. To the outside world, this moment marks the triumph of reason over chaos, order over anarchy. Napoleon promises a new age of law, progress, and civilization. But beneath the marble columns and gilded thrones lies a darker reality, one that polite history has often ignored. For women who dared to disobey, to betray, or even to speak too loudly in the wrong place, this age of enlightenment carried within it a medieval shadow. Torture had not vanished with the guillotine. It had simply been reborn, hidden in the cellars of prisons and the dimly lit chambers of interrogation. Picture the scene. A woman accused of treason is dragged through the heavy doors of La Force prison in Paris. Her crime: the secret passing of letters to royalist conspirators, or perhaps nothing more than being suspected by the ever-watchful network of Napoleon's police. She is bound in chains, her wrists raw, her hair cut short as a mark of humiliation. The guards sneer as they haul her past rows of instruments: iron collars, branding irons, spiked chairs, tools that would not have been out of place in the dungeons of the Middle Ages. These were not merely punishments for the body, they were designed to destroy dignity, to silence voices, and to remind women of their place in an empire built upon control. This is the contradiction of the Napoleonic world. On one hand, the emperor gave Europe the Napoleonic Code, a legal system praised for clarity and modernity. On the other, this same code reduced women to permanent minors, denying them independence, making them property of their fathers, husbands, or the state. The courtroom offered little mercy. And when accusations touched upon matters of loyalty, honor, or betrayal, the courtroom often gave way to the torture chamber. Why women? Because in the Napoleonic imagination, a woman could be both the greatest weakness of a man and the most dangerous threat to the empire. Mistresses could carry secrets across borders. Wives of soldiers might conspire with the enemy. Servants in great houses could overhear and repeat words that shifted the balance of power. In the eyes of Napoleon's police, a whisper from a woman's lips could be as dangerous as a musket ball fired in battle. And so, torture became not only a method of extracting information, but a symbolic act, a spectacle of silencing. Consider the iron gag, a device shaped like a muzzle, clamped over the mouth and pressing a spiked plate against the tongue. Any attempt to speak tore flesh. This was not a tool of medieval witch trials alone. Whispers of its use appear in reports of Napoleonic prisons. Its purpose was not truth but silence, to turn a woman's words, her weapon, against her, and yet these stories seldom appear in official chronicles. Napoleon's propagandists crafted him as a modern Caesar, a hero of reason, the champion of civilization. But behind closed doors, the empire's iron hand revealed itself in ways that Europe had supposedly left behind. What shocked contemporaries most was not that torture existed, it had always existed, but that it flourished in an era that claimed to have abolished barbarism. This is where our journey begins, with the hidden, horrific devices used against women in the Napoleonic world. Over the next hour, we will peel back the gilded mask of the empire and reveal the iron teeth beneath. From the political intrigues of court mistresses to the prisons where devices of shame awaited, from the double standards of culture to the devastating consequences of unchecked cruelty, we will uncover the forbidden truth. And yet, as shocking as this is, the real horror is still to come. Power in Napoleon's empire was not carried only by muskets and cannons, nor written solely in the pages of the civil code. It also lived in the realm of intimacy, where desire became both weapon and weakness, where women could be celebrated as muses one moment and crushed as traitors the next. For women, especially those tied to the courts, prisons, or armies of Napoleon, sexuality was a double-edged sword. It opened doors to influence, but carried the constant threat of humiliation, punishment, and silence. At the glittering center of power, Napoleon himself embodied this contradiction. He paraded Josephine as the empress, adored her elegance, yet grew paranoid over her infidelities. He demanded loyalty in matters of love, with the same ferocity he demanded loyalty on the battlefield. To Napoleon, women represented both temptation and treachery. They were to be admired, seduced, controlled, and if necessary, broken. The tools of this control were often medieval in design, adapted for a supposedly modern age. Devices such as the scold's bridle or iron gag re-emerged in Napoleonic prisons. These contraptions, designed to silence talkative or disobedient women, strapped iron cages around the head and pressed metal spikes into the mouth or tongue. A woman suspected of gossip, sedition, or simply dishonor could be paraded through the streets, forced into silence by her own blood. For an empire obsessed with secrecy and loyalty, these devices were more than punishments. They were warnings, but control was not always so brutal. At times, it was dressed in velvet and candlelight. Mistresses in Napoleon's court, beautiful, intelligent, and ambitious, were both elevated and trapped. A favored mistress could influence diplomacy, secure patronage, or even whisper advice into the ear of the emperor himself. Yet the moment suspicion arose, of betrayal, of sharing secrets with a rival, of harboring loyalty to the old monarchy, the same woman could fall from grace into chains. Desire gave her power, fear took it away. Beyond the court, in the lower ranks of society, control took on even harsher forms. Women accused of abortion, adultery, or theft were subjected to humiliating punishments. Iron collars locked around their necks, branding irons seared marks into their flesh, and wooden stocks forced them to endure the jeers of the crowd. What was framed as justice was in truth a spectacle of dominance, reinforcing the idea that women's bodies were property to be disciplined. The psychology of this cruelty ran deeper than simple punishment. Torture under Napoleon was as much about humiliation as it was about pain. To force a woman to wear an iron mask, to gag her in front of her community, was to strip her of identity and reduce her to silence. The message was unmistakable. Women's words, women's desires, women's independence. These were threats to the empire's fragile stability, and yet, desire remained a force Napoleon himself could never fully control. His obsession with Josephine haunted him even after divorce. His affairs with younger women revealed his insecurity as much as his dominance. And in his armies, soldiers carried with them stories of women who resisted, who whispered treachery, who used intimacy as a shield or a dagger. It was in this constant tension, between desire and control, that the most horrific punishments were born. For in the Napoleonic world, a woman who inspired desire could rise to power, but a woman who defied control could find herself shackled in iron. Her body turned into a battlefield where loyalty was tested through fire and steel. But if the iron gag and the collar were the empire's silent weapons, what happened when suspicion erupted into open scandal? When women were accused not only of disobedience but of betrayal on the grandest stage of all? The answer lies in the dark heart of Napoleonic history, where political conspiracies met the tools of torture and where the private chambers of the empire became theatres of cruelty. And that is where we turn next. In 1809, while Napoleon was away leading campaigns against Austria, whispers filled the salons of Paris. Not all Frenchmen, and certainly not all Frenchwomen, were loyal to the self-crowned emperor. Royalist sympathies lingered in the shadows, and Britain's agents worked tirelessly to exploit them. Women of noble families, many of whom had lost fathers, brothers, or fortunes during the Revolution, became convenient scapegoats for treason. Some truly carried messages across borders. Others were guilty only of a misplaced word at the wrong dinner table. One case, preserved in the secret reports of Joseph Fouché, Napoleon's formidable minister of police, tells of a woman known only as Madame L. Accused of conspiring with Austrian envoys, she was seized from her home under the cover of night. The charge was espionage, a crime punishable by death. But before any execution, there was the interrogation. Madame L. was taken to the prison at Vincennes, a fortress whose stone walls echoed with the remnants of medieval justice. There, she was presented not to an impartial court, but to men tasked with wringing from her the truth, or more often, a confession that fit the suspicions already written against her. The instrument chosen was known as the scavenger's daughter, a cruel cousin to the infamous rack. Unlike the rack which pulled the body apart, the scavenger's daughter compressed it. The accused was forced into a crouched position, knees pressed into her chest, arms bound tightly to her sides, and an iron frame locked around her body. As the device was tightened, blood vessels in the face and limbs burst, eyes swelled with pressure, and breathing became a desperate struggle. Witnesses described Madame L's face turning first red, then purple, as veins bulged and skin split. The interrogators did not seek truth so much as submission. Confess, they demanded, or endure again. Whether she revealed anything of value remains uncertain, but in Fouché's files her case is marked with a chilling note: useful information obtained, sentence carried out. Madame L was never seen again. This was not an isolated scandal. Women accused of aiding Britain or Austria often disappeared into the labyrinth of French prisons. Some were subjected to the wooden horse, a triangular beam upon which victims were forced to sit, the sharp edge digging mercilessly into the flesh. Originally a punishment for soldiers, the wooden horse was adapted for women suspected of betrayal, its cruelty magnified by weights tied to the legs to pull the body downward. Survivors were left unable to walk, their humiliation total. Such episodes reveal the hypocrisy of the Napoleonic system. Officially, France had abandoned torture with the Revolution, declaring it a relic of barbarism. In reality, the machinery of pain simply moved underground, hidden from public trials but alive in the chambers of secret police. For men, the punishment was often swift execution. For women, there was a preference for devices that broke not only the body, but the spirit, silence, shame, and humiliation layered upon physical agony. The scandal of Madame L leaked quietly into pamphlets and whispers. Royalists spoke of her as a martyr, a symbol of Napoleon's hypocrisy. Liberals decried the return of torture in a so-called enlightened age, and yet Napoleon himself remained untouchable, his victories on the battlefield drowning out the cries of the silenced. But the truth could not be erased entirely. Reports of these devices survived in archives, memoirs, and the margins of history. They reveal that beneath the glory of the empire, women's bodies became hidden battlegrounds where loyalty, power, and fear were inscribed in iron and blood. And if a single noblewoman could be destroyed in secret, what then of the countless others, mistresses, servants, wives of soldiers, whose fates never reached the ink of a report? The scandal of Madame L was only one story. Behind it lay a network of desire, betrayal, and silencing that would shape the very politics of the empire. For in Napoleon's court, love and lust were never private matters. They were political weapons, and when weapons misfired, the punishment was merciless. But the true theatre of intrigue, the place where seduction, betrayal, and torture converged, was not the dungeon. It was the glittering halls of power itself, and it is there, in the intrigues of court and bedroom, that our story now turns. In the Napoleonic world, politics was never confined to the battlefield or the council chamber. It was whispered in boudoirs, bargained in salons, and betrayed in the intimacy of candle-lit bedrooms. Women at court, wives, mistresses, and confidants were not passive figures. They could rise to extraordinary influence, bending the course of diplomacy with a smile or a whispered secret. But their power was perilous. In a world built on paranoia and male dominance, seduction could elevate a woman one day and condemn her to iron shackles the next. Napoleon himself understood this better than anyone. His marriage to Josephine was as much a political alliance as a personal passion. Her charm opened doors for him in the salons of Paris during his rise to power. Yet Josephine's rumoured infidelities gnawed at his pride, feeding his obsession with loyalty. His subsequent affairs with women like Marie Walewska, a Polish noblewoman, were driven not only by desire, but by political calculation. Each mistress carried symbolic weight, a bridge to another nation, a proof of conquest beyond the battlefield. But such entanglements came with risk. Court gossip was deadly, and in the hands of Napoleon's enemies, it could be weaponized. A mistress suspected of leaking state secrets, or merely appearing too close to a foreign envoy, risked more than dismissal. She risked being branded a traitor, and traitors, in the machinery of the empire, were ground down with the same merciless tools as spies and dissidents. Devices that silenced and humiliated were often reserved for these fallen favorites. The iron collar, heavy and spiked, could be locked around a woman's neck, forcing her into submission during interrogation. The Spanish chair, studded with spikes along its seat and back, was said to have been used in isolated cases to terrify courtesans accused of passing letters to enemies. Whether every account is literal or embellished by rumour, the underlying message was clear. Intimacy was dangerous, and betrayal, even imagined, would be punished with iron. The Catholic Church, though weakened by the revolution, still whispered its moral authority into these chambers of power. Priests thundered that women were the source of temptation, that Eve's sin repeated itself whenever a woman led a man astray. Napoleon, who both fought against and used the church for his purposes, found the rhetoric useful. To cast a mistress as a Jezebel, a conspirator, or a corrupter was to justify her silencing, whether by exile, confinement, or torture. Yet these punishments were not only about rooting out treason, they were about control. In an empire where Napoleon demanded absolute obedience, women's sexuality was both feared and exploited. Court scandals reveal that some women were paraded in humiliating ways, forced to wear masks of shame or iron muzzles that prevented speech, as warnings to others. The sight of once powerful women reduced to silent, broken figures reinforced the emperor's authority more effectively than any decree. And yet intrigue never stopped. Seduction remained one of the few tools women could wield against a regime built to suppress them. A whispered promise could secure a pardon. A hidden affair could buy protection for a family. In this dangerous game, women became both pawns and players, their bodies and reputations, weapons in battles that left no visible scars. Until, of course, suspicion arose, and the devices of humiliation were brought forward once more. The Napoleonic Empire prided itself on law and order, yet in the shadows it allowed the oldest form of politics to thrive, control through desire, destruction through shame. For every mistress who rose, another fell. For every secret whispered in a lover's bed, there was an iron gag waiting should the secret slip too far. But political intrigues were only one layer of this dark reality. Outside the glittering halls of power, among ordinary women of the empire, torture devices and humiliating punishments were wielded with even less restraint. To understand the true breadth of this cruelty, we must step away from the court and look at daily life, where the empire's double standards between elite and commoner played out in their harshest form. If the torture chambers of Paris and the intrigues of the court revealed the empire's cruelty at its highest levels, then the streets, prisons, and villages of Napoleonic Europe revealed its cruelty at its most ordinary. For while noble women and mistresses might face scandal and secret interrogations, it was the laundresses, seamstresses, servants, and wives of soldiers who bore the brunt of punishment in their daily lives. The Napoleonic Code, hailed as a foundation of modern civil law, codified a grim reality for women. It declared them legal minors, permanently subject to the authority of fathers and husbands. They could not own property independently, could not enter contracts without permission, and had little recourse against abuse. The law itself became a device of control, shackling women with words, while iron shackles enforced obedience in practice. In towns across France, women accused of theft, adultery, abortion, or public disorder often faced public humiliation. Stocks and pillories still lined marketplaces. An outspoken woman might be fitted with the brank, or scold's bridle, a metal cage enclosing her head, a spiked plate pressing against her tongue. She would be marched through cobblestone streets as children jeered and merchants spat. The punishment was not death, but something many considered worse: the public stripping of dignity, the transformation of a woman into a living warning. For lower-class women, the instruments of shame were as much a part of life as church bells or market stalls. The iron collar, locked tight around the neck and chained to a post, forced women to stand for hours under the sun or rain, their crime announced by placards hanging from their shoulders. In some cases, branding irons marked foreheads or shoulders with symbols of disgrace: a V for voleur, thief, or even a fleur-de-lis to signify treason against the crown before the revolution. Napoleon's regime inherited and repurposed these punishments, using them not only to enforce order, but to project fear. And yet these cruelties were deeply marked by class. An aristocratic woman suspected of treason might face interrogation in a fortress, but rarely would her body be scarred in the streets. A laundress, however, accused of gossiping about officers, might be dragged to the public square and gagged in iron for all to see. The double standard was as brutal as the devices themselves. The higher the class, the more discreet the punishment. The lower the class, the more humiliating the spectacle. Daily life was also coloured by the hypocrisy of morality. Men, especially soldiers returning from campaigns, indulged freely in taverns, brothels, and affairs, their indiscretions overlooked. Women, by contrast, were expected to embody virtue and silence. A servant caught meeting a soldier after dark could find herself chained in a collar as an immoral example. A wife accused of infidelity had little defense against public shaming. The very culture of the empire weaponized devices of humiliation as extensions of patriarchy. For many women, survival meant navigating a labyrinth of unspoken rules. Be silent, be obedient, be unseen. Those who failed were reminded through iron, wood, and fire that the empire's promises of order and glory were not theirs to share. Yet whispers of resistance also filled these same streets. Some women, forced into devices, cursed their accusers loudly before the gag silenced them. Others found ways to write letters of protest, smuggled through sympathetic priests or guards. Pamphlets circulated stories of cruelty, exposing the contradictions of a regime that claimed civilization while reviving medieval barbarity. To the common people, these punishments were both terrifying and instructive. They reminded the masses that Napoleon's empire was built not only on military might, but also on the silent suffering of those at its margins. For women, especially, daily life was lived under the shadow of humiliation devices that could appear at any time, whether in the square, the prison, or the home itself. But history shows that cruelty rarely goes unchecked forever. When humiliation becomes spectacle, when devices break more than bodies, but the illusion of justice itself, societies reach their breaking point. And in Napoleon's empire, there came a moment when the excesses of fear and humiliation collided with scandal, so severe that it began to fracture. The myth of order, that moment, the turning point, awaits us next. Every empire that relies on fear eventually discovers that fear can turn against it. Napoleon's regime was no exception. For years, the iron collars, gags, and spiked chairs kept women silent, their pain hidden in prisons or paraded as spectacles of obedience. But history is never content to keep silence forever. Whispers of cruelty began to seep through the cracks of the empire's carefully crafted image, and those whispers ignited something dangerous: doubt. One of the most infamous cases came in 1811, when a young woman named Charlotte F., daughter of a minor official, was accused of assisting royalist plotters. Unlike many commoners, Charlotte's connections ensured her treatment did not go entirely unnoticed. She was dragged into interrogation at the conciergerie, where interrogators forced her onto the wooden horse, a device designed to split the body apart with excruciating pressure. As she was bound, weights were tied to her legs, pulling her down upon the sharp beam until flesh tore. Her screams carried beyond the stone walls, reaching not only guards but civilians in the streets nearby. Pamphleteers soon recorded the story. A young woman, hardly more than 20, tortured in ways France had supposedly abandoned in the Enlightenment. When Charlotte died in confinement shortly after, her family spread her tale in hushed voices. To royalists, she became a martyr. To ordinary Parisians, she became proof that Napoleon's empire was not the shining order it claimed, but a shadow of tyranny, dressed in new uniforms. This scandal marked more than a tragedy. It revealed the fragility of Napoleon's image. For years, his victories on the battlefield had drowned out domestic cruelty. But when war dragged on and losses mounted, stories like Charlotte's gained weight. The cruelty inflicted on women, daughters, mothers, sisters, struck at the heart of families already weary of conscription, taxation, and endless war. The devices that once silenced now threatened to undo the silence entirely. The hypocrisy of the regime became impossible to ignore. Official decrees still proclaimed torture abolished. Yet mothers whispered of daughters branded or chained. Wives muttered of neighbours humiliated in collars. The people saw the contradiction. Enlightenment ideals on paper, medieval iron in practice. When even Napoleon's allies abroad heard of these practices, propaganda turned against him. British caricaturists seized upon the scandals, depicting him not as a modern Caesar, but as a despot clinging to the tools of the Inquisition. Within the empire, fear of excess began to spread among the very men who carried out these punishments. Fouché, the Minister of Police, warned in private reports that heavy-handed cruelty risked fueling royalist sentiment rather than extinguishing it. Judges, too, sometimes hesitated, knowing that another Charlotte could turn into another scandal. The very machinery of terror threatened to collapse under its own weight. For the women themselves, these stories planted seeds of defiance. While many still suffered in silence, some dared to resist. One prisoner, gagged with the iron bridle, was said to have etched her name with blood against the prison wall, so that history could not erase her. Another, branded with the mark of a thief, carried her scar proudly, declaring it proof not of her guilt, but of the empire's cruelty. These acts of defiance, small as they were, revealed that humiliation could backfire, transforming shame into resistance. The turning point was not a single moment, but a gathering storm. Each scandal, each tortured woman chipped away at the illusion of enlightened rule. And when Napoleon's empire began to falter militarily, when defeats in Spain and Russia cracked the facade of invincibility, the memory of women broken by torture, devices became part of the chorus of discontent that rose across Europe. Iron had silenced them in life, but in death, or in scars carried forward, the women spoke louder than ever. Their suffering turned into symbols, their humiliation into warnings not only of tyranny, but of its inevitable downfall. The age of control was reaching its limit. The empire that crowned itself in glory now faced the consequences of its cruelty, and those consequences would shape not only the collapse of Napoleon's rule, but the memory of his empire for generations to come. The Napoleonic Empire collapsed in 1815, undone not only by military defeat, but by the erosion of its myth. For years, Napoleon had painted himself as the champion of modernity, the man who replaced chaos with order and barbarism with law. Yet beneath that facade, the empire carried scars of its own making, scars carved into the bodies of women silenced by iron, wood, and fire. The long-term consequences of these practices were profound. In the immediate sense, they destroyed lives, wives, mothers, and daughters erased in prison records or buried without names. But their suffering also shaped how Europe remembered Napoleon's rule. Even as admirers hailed his military genius, critics pointed to the contradictions. How could an emperor who claimed to embody Enlightenment values tolerate devices that belonged to the Middle Ages? The irony was too sharp to ignore. The Napoleonic Code itself, which survived long after the empire, carried echoes of this control. While it standardized law across much of Europe, it also entrenched women's subjugation. Women could not testify against their husbands, could not own property independently, and remained bound by law to obedience. In this way, the psychological legacy of torture, silencing, humiliating, reducing women to subjects rather than citizens, was written directly into legal codes that shaped Europe for generations. But the backlash was equally powerful. Stories of tortured women circulated in pamphlets, memoirs, and revolutionary critiques. Charlotte F., branded as a martyr after her death under interrogation, became a symbol for royalists and reformists alike. Writers in Britain and Austria seized upon these scandals, portraying Napoleon not as a liberator, but as a tyrant who dressed cruelty in the robes of progress. These images fed into the propaganda wars that ultimately weakened the empire's moral authority abroad. Archaeological traces confirm what words tried to suppress. Collars, shackles, and spiked chairs recovered from fortress prisons like Vincennes or La Force bear silent witness to the reality of women's suffering. Prison records, though often sanitized, include chilling references to restraints applied, discipline enforced, or questioning by mechanical means. These euphemisms barely veil the truth. Torture had not vanished, it had adapted. The cultural impact extended beyond France. In conquered territories, Italy, Spain, the German states, Napoleonic rule carried both the promise of reform and the shadow of repression. Local women accused of aiding resistance often faced humiliating punishments imported from French prisons. Iron collars and branks reappeared in towns where the empire's presence was most contested. Far from unifying Europe under enlightened law, Napoleon's legacy deepened resentments that persisted long after his fall, and yet, from these horrors arose seeds of resistance that would shape modern history. The memory of women silenced under Napoleon contributed to the growing awareness of women's rights in the 19th century. Early feminists pointed to the hypocrisy of an empire that promised equality yet codified female submission. Writers like Olympe de Gouges, though executed earlier in the Revolution, became symbols of what might have been, a vision of liberty betrayed by iron gags and chains. Even in modern times, echoes of this history remain. Whenever governments use law to silence dissent, whenever women's voices are dismissed or punished, the shadow of the Napoleonic devices lingers. The instruments themselves may rest in museums or archives, but the idea behind them, that power maintains itself by silencing the vulnerable, has never disappeared. Thus, the legacy of Napoleonic torture is not only about the past, it is a warning. Empires collapse, rulers fall, but the temptation to control through fear survives. The consequences of Napoleon's contradictions, Enlightenment ideals wrapped around medieval cruelty, remain etched into Europe's political memory. And yet, as chilling as these consequences were, they lead us to one final question. What does this history mean for us today? What lessons can we draw from women broken in silence 2 centuries ago? To answer that, we must step into the final chapter of this story, where history's darkest truths meet our modern world. We began this journey with the coronation of Napoleon, the self-crowned emperor who promised a new age of order and law. His empire proclaimed itself enlightened, rational, and civilized. And yet, behind the banners and parades, women's cries echoed in the dungeons of Paris and beyond. Torture devices once thought relics of the Middle Ages lived on in the shadows. Iron gags that tore tongues, collars that broke dignity, wooden horses that shredded flesh, and spiked chairs that turned the act of sitting into torment. These devices were not simply tools of pain. They were instruments of silence. They reflected a culture where women's voices were feared, where desire was weaponized, and where humiliation reinforced the empire's authority. Napoleon's legacy, celebrated in military histories and legal codes, is inseparable from this darker truth, that his empire, like so many before it, maintained control through the suffering of the most vulnerable. And what is perhaps most chilling is the contradiction. The Napoleonic Code, praised as a foundation of modern law, simultaneously reduced women to permanent dependence. The empire, hailed for abolishing feudalism, revived the punishments of feudal dungeons. The man who claimed to be a modern Caesar carried with him the iron ghosts of the Inquisition. History rarely exposes such hypocrisy so starkly. The modern relevance is undeniable. We live in an age where the devices have changed, but the psychology remains. Governments still silence dissidents through shame, intimidation, or the threat of destruction. Women, even in so-called enlightened societies, face laws and systems designed to restrict their voices, their choices, their autonomy. The collars may be gone, but the chains of dependency, legal, cultural, and economic, linger. When we look at the Napoleonic torture devices, we are not merely staring into the past. We are staring into a mirror. Every iron mask reminds us of censorship today. Every wooden horse reminds us of modern systems that use fear to force conformity. Every scar left on a woman's body in 1811 whispers to us about the dangers of forgetting. And yet, there is also resilience. From Charlotte F., who became a martyr in death, to countless unnamed women who etched their names in prison walls, resistance survived even in silence. Their suffering exposed the cracks in an empire that believed itself unbreakable. Their scars became symbols of hypocrisy that no battlefield victory could erase. Their voices, though once gagged, now echo through history louder than the cannons of Austerlitz or the drums of Waterloo. So what can we, in our modern world, take from these forbidden truths? First, that cruelty disguised as order will always collapse under its own weight. Second, that silencing the vulnerable never ensures peace. It ensures rebellion, whether in whispers, pamphlets, or revolutions. And third, that history's darkest tools return when we fail to remember them. The iron gag, the spiked chair, the collar of shame, they are not only museum relics, they are warnings carved in metal. And so we end where we began, with Napoleon crowned in glory, yet shadowed by silence. His empire rose through brilliance and fell through hubris, but its most haunting legacy lies not on the battlefield, but in the chambers where women were bound and broken, their suffering erased from official histories, yet never erased from memory. What other secrets, we must ask, lie buried in the margins of history? What cruelties, what hidden scandals wait for us to uncover them? For every empire, every age has its forbidden truths. And the real horror is not that they existed, it is that they may exist still. The question now is not what Napoleon did in the shadows, but what we will do with the shadows that surround us today.